Hi everybody, this is International Master Keaton Kira doing another video, and we're going to continue to talk about the Yugoslav attack today. So we'll go through the opening moves of the dragon, and now this in this position we've already covered the two main moves in previous videos. I discussed the move bishop c4 and castling queenside on move 9 for white. But today we're going to talk about a third move that's not quite as popular as the two moves I just mentioned, but it's gaining popularity, and if you are planning on playing the dragon, I guarantee at some point you will see this move, and you'll want to know how to play against it. So the move is g4 on move 9. I saw this move for the first time when I was rated about 1900, and unfortunately I was playing against Grandmaster Alex Shabalov, and that game didn't go very well for me. I didn't react very well to this move. And we're going to talk about three standard ways that black can react to this line g4. So first of all, what is the point of g4? Why would white play g4 in this position? Of course, it's a useful move for white to attack on the king side, to have that pawn up the board, but more importantly, it prevents black from playing d5, which is a very common way to answer when white castles queenside. So if black were to play d5, now white can go g5 and kick the knight away from f6, which will leave the d5 pawn unprotected, and white will win a pawn. So, if d5 doesn't work here, then what about the plan that black usually plays against the bishop c4 line, where black can go bishop d7, and then put his rook on c8, and play knight e5 and knight c4? Well, that's not going to work very well either, because the key in this position, this bishop on f1, hasn't moved. So if the bishop is able to capture the knight on c4 without ever moving, white will basically be playing the line where he played bishop c4 and then bishop b3 with two extra tempos. Because in that line, white makes two bishop moves, and then he captures the knight. So if white can capture that knight without ever having moved his bishop, then he's two tempos up, which of course in the dragon is the difference between life and death. So this plan of bishop d7, rook c8, knight e5, knight c4, it really doesn't work for black in this position. So how should black proceed? The three moves that we're going to talk about today, which are all interesting possibilities, are first of all the daring sacrifice, bishop takes g4. It is possible. Whether or not it's sound we'll get into a little bit later, but it is playable. Bishop takes g4. The main move, bishop e6, which is the most popular move in this position. And there's another move, knight takes d4, followed by bishop e6, which in some situations directly transposes to bishop e6, but there are some small differences. Okay, so let's talk about this crazy-looking move, bishop takes g4. So black sacrifices a piece for two pawns. There is some compensation. I feel that if white plays correctly in this position, there's not enough compensation. I think with accurate play, white can get a pretty good position. However, white does really need to know what he's doing, otherwise this can become very dangerous. So, this sacrifice, I think it's great for blitz games, and I think it's great against unprepared opponents. I wouldn't necessarily play it against a grandmaster who is well prepared against this line. So the immediate idea for black is to capture this bishop on e3 and then take the knight on d4. So that's black's threat, and white has to do something about that. a lot of people's immediate reaction is to pull that bishop out of the fire with bishop g1. And bishop g1 is not a very good move, because now white's never going to be able to castle queenside, because black can pin white's queen with bishop h6. So here, I think black can just continue with e6, which is a useful move, introducing the threat of queen h4 check against white's open king. And e6 is nice to cover that d5 square and keep the white knight out of d5. And now white cannot escape that check by castling, because bishop h6 pins the queen. So bishop g1 is not a very good move here for white. The best move for white is knight b3. He can solve the problem of his unprotected pieces by just pulling the knight back. So black should continue here with the aggressive move a5, with the idea to play a4 and dislodge the knight from b3, and then continue to play by playing a3 and disrupt white's queenside and force this b2 pawn to react, which will then weaken the knight on c3 that the bishop is aiming at, leading to some tactical possibilities for black. So white should answer this a5 move by playing a4. Now a4 weakens the square on b4, which this black knight will go ahead and settle into. Knight to b4. So black has a lot of threats here. Simply to take on e3 is a huge threat, where if the queen captured, then knight takes c2 check would fork the entire family. So white needs to castle here, which protects the c2 pawn, and now black continues to pile on the pressure with rook c8. Looks very dangerous. Now black has another threat to go bishop takes knight on c3, and then when white recaptures with the pawn, black can go knight a2 check, forking the king with the c3 pawn, which black will then capture with his knight, having 3 pawns for the piece and a very good position. So again, white needs to react precisely and find the move king to b1, which prevents those threats. And now black doesn't have any real clear continuation. Probably the best way is to go ahead and trade the knight for the bishop, go ahead and eliminate that dark square bishop, and now black can try for counterplay along the dark squares with queen c7, threatening to take that knight on c3 and restore material equality by getting 3 pawns for a piece. And the knight on c3 is pinned to the pawn on c2, so it's not possible to play knight b5 or knight d5 because there's queen takes c2 check with mate on the way. So white needs to find one more accurate move here, knight to d4, and block the bishop. And now white is fine and probably better, since he has an extra piece for 2 pawns, and black can continue to make white's life a little bit difficult by playing queen c5 and pinning that knight. And white's conversion of his material advantage in this position is far from simple. This is not an easy position for white to win. Black has 2 pawns for the piece, which is compensation in itself, and black has a lot of actively placed pieces. A nice bishop on g7, a strong knight on b4, and his queen and rook working along the c-file. In theory, this position is good for white. It's not enough compensation here for the material deficit. However, if you consider all aspects of this position, white did have to find a lot of accurate moves to survive. So whether or not you want to play this variation with bishop takes g4, it's your call. You certainly could surprise your opponent and win several games in miniature fashion. However, if you do run across a well-prepared opponent, don't be terribly surprised if you end up with not the best position. So, on to more sound ways of handling this g4 move. Now let's discuss the moves bishop e6 and knight takes d4, which are very similar in nature. So, bishop e6 The idea of playing this move right away is white needs to castle here rather than go ahead and play h4 and start attacking, because here black has ideas up his sleeve like knight e5 and bishop c4 and trying to win over that c4 square. And if he castles, then this should transpose to the aforementioned knight takes d4 line. However, bishop e6 offers white the opportunity to take that bishop. And so we'll need to discuss that position, because that's really the main difference of the two lines. So why would you ever play bishop e6 instead of the immediate knight takes d4? Well, in this position, after you trade and then go bishop e6, white does not need to be compelled to castle here. He can play h4 first, although he will eventually run out of extra moves and at some point will have to castle. It won't be possible here for white to get a successful attack without castling. So very often these two lines will transpose. So bishop e6, and now lately the move knight takes e6, which was once thought to not be very good, has become incredibly popular due to a recent game from the US Championship, Nakamura-Robson, where Nakamura won a brilliant game, but I think one thing that people fail to realize about that game is Nakamura was able to win that one because he's a great player. It really didn't have much to do with the opening. I think black was fine from the opening in that game. Nevertheless, I encourage you guys to look at that game. It's a very entertaining game with an incredible finish. You can look up Nakamura-Robson from the US Championship in 2012. So, knight takes e6, pawn takes, and now white castles. So, taking with the pawn on e6 is not such a bad thing. It gives the rook a nice file, and the pawn helps to control the center. Black has a very good center here. And here black should continue with knight e5, of course threatening f3, which forces white to play bishop e2. And now, as in other lines, black needs to try to get his knight to c4, and there are a couple ways of doing that. In the game I mentioned, Ray Robson played queen to c8 with the idea of playing knight c4, and in that one the position was very off balance, and I think it was double-edged, and I think fine for black. But there's another move, rook c8, that's also very playable. You can go rook c8 here with the idea of playing knight c4. White will usually go knight b5. This is white's idea in this line. It's not to attack the a7 pawn, but rather to transfer this knight to d4, where it can pressure the e6 pawn. And here black can continue with queen d7. He'll be very happy if white takes on a7. Now the rook can go to a8, and as we so often see in the dragon, if white wants to take black's pawns on the queen side, black can use those files to attack white's king. But I don't think white will really ever consider this move. Instead, he'll go knight d4, which is the main idea. And now black can go knight c4 and get his rook up to c4 with the idea of doubling the rooks. And I think it's a pretty even middle game position with attacking chances for both sides. So let's revert back to the position after g4. And let's talk about knight takes d4, which doesn't allow the option of the knight capturing the bishop on e6. Now, as I mentioned, white does not need to castle here. He can start with h4, but if he plays like this, black will just play with the same plan as I show against castling. Black's plan is to go queen a5, rook from f to c8, rook from a to b8, and then go b5, b4, and torch white's queen side, where his king at some point is going to have to end up. So, really, in the end, white won't save any tempos by playing h4. So, let's go ahead and look at this position, which can also be reached by playing, if you play bishop e6 on move 9 and white castles, then black could play knight takes d4, bishop takes d4, queen a5, and the same position will be reached. So, knight takes d4, bishop takes d4, bishop e6, white castles, and now queen a5, attacking the a2 pawn. And white should play a3 here. King b1 is a waste of a tempo, because after rook from f to c8, a3 probably needs to be played anyway. There are rook c3 ideas here, with the idea to sacrifice the exchange and then take on a2 with check. And also, b5 would be possible, because it's hard for white to successfully take that pawn as long as a2 is unprotected. So king b1 doesn't really make sense, because white will need to play a3 anyway. So white plays a3, and now rook f c8. So white will continue h4. He tries to attack on the king side. And rook a b8, h5, and b5. So the b5 pawn can't be taken. Well, it can be, but it's not very good for white, because then the rook would take, protecting the queen, and black will get an excellent position with two minor pieces for a rook and pawn. And in this middle game, the two minor pieces are much more powerful than the rook. And white's king is not in a good position here. So white needs to continue by taking on g6, and now black can recapture either way. I'm going to recommend h takes g6, although f takes g6 is also playable and has an interesting idea behind it as well. So h takes g6, this way it keeps the black pawns together. And white has a chance here to force an endgame. And it's his last chance to force the endgame. If he gets too aggressive here, then there's no turning back. But white can play knight to d5, bringing the knight to the center, and of course, allowing the queens to face each other. Now black will continue by taking the queen. White takes, and then he can trade on d5. Bishop takes g7, king takes g7, e takes d5, bishop d7 back, and almost all endgames that come from these kinds of positions in the dragon are roughly equal. And this position is no exception. This is a roughly equal endgame, with chances for both sides. However, if white wants to play more aggressively and not force the endgame, he has to be very careful, because once black gets in the move b4, black's position is usually winning. The attack is just too powerful for white to stop. But white can prevent b4 with a very creative move, queen to g5, pinning this pawn on b5 to black's queen. But I believe black has a very good answer to this. A lot of people have the tendency, if they're not so familiar with this position for black, to play queen c7. Queen c7 seems logical. You pull the queen out of the pin and renew the threat to play b4. But queen c7 is actually playing into white's hands. This is not a move that black wants to play. White has a very nice answer, e5, attacking the knight, which is, of course, a very important defender of the king's side, and now the knight really can't move away, because pawn takes pawn hitting the queen, which would allow white to then trade off the bishops on g7, and black's king would be completely exposed here. So black would need to take on e5, but now white recaptures with the bishop, skewering the rook on b8. However, black has a seemingly fine answer to that. He can go queen c5, in turn pinning the white bishop to the queen. However, it's white who has the last tactical resource in this position. This might be a good opportunity for you to pause the video and find a forced win for white from this position. White can win this position with a brilliant idea. Bishop takes f6, breaking the pin and protecting his own queen, black would be forced to take back, and now the dagger, rook to d8 check, where black's rook would have to take, and then the black queen will be lost. So queen c7 is not a good idea. What black needs to fight to do in these positions is to somehow break the pin that white has. And quickly, because I mentioned earlier that black could also take with the f-pawn, after he takes with the f-pawn, white would still go queen g5. And I just want to mention that here black has a different idea than what I'm going to show in the h takes line. Here black can drop his bishop back to f7 with the intention of breaking the pin by playing e5. And white would not want to go e5 himself here, because now black can play b4, and it's black who's pinning white's pawn to his queen. So black's turned the tables on white in this position. So that idea is playable, but here in the h takes line, which I feel is better for a lot of reasons, also because white, could go knight d5 here and go to the endgame, in which case black will want his pawns connected. So in the h takes line with queen g5, here black has a different idea that's very strong. He can go d5, breaking white's pin on his b pawn and preparing to go b4. Now if white takes with his knight, we'll definitely take that knight with our bishop. Not with our knight, because we don't want to allow these bishops to get traded and for the black king to come open. So we would take with the bishop, and after pawn takes, then play b4, which is always black's attacking idea in this position. So after white plays e takes d5, black still plays b4, and now it's black who's pinning the white pawn to white's queen. And remember, if black can get in that move b4, his position's usually very good. And I'm going to show you a beautiful variation here that illustrates the power of black's attack in these kinds of positions. So white should continue a takes b4, and now we'll take with the rook, introducing the rook into the attack. The queen is still pinning the pawn, and sometimes there are queen a1 ideas here. Very difficult for white to defend this position. Black is already much better. If black tries the move bishop e5, trying to protect his pawn and to get his bishop out of harm's way, black has an incredible continuation. Bishop takes g4, upsetting the balance of everything on the white king side and threatening to go bishop takes f3. So after pawn takes, now another bolt from the blue, rook takes c3, eliminating the knight and preparing to bring black's own knight into e4. If bishop takes rook, knight e4 attacking the queen and preparing queen a1 checkmate, since the d2 square is covered by the knight. If white takes on b4 with the pawn, then still knight to e4 with the same checkmate threat. White can go pawn takes rook, now covering the a1 square with the bishop, but there's no need for black to panic. He can simply play queen a3 check, and after king b1, now not take the queen, but rather knight c3 check. Bishop takes is forced, and after bishop takes, despite being down 2 rooks, black has an unstoppable checkmate threat. If rook h8 check, black can simply take with the king and then hide back on g8, and mate is unavoidable. So this is just one nice variation that demonstrates how powerful black's attack is after he gets in the b4 move in those positions. And if white is smart, he should never allow black to get that move in, or he won't be able to survive very long in that position. Okay, so to recap, we covered all the lines, or all of the main lines after white plays g4 on move 9. There's the ambitious but slightly sketchy sacrifice, bishop takes g4. And then there are the the two very similar ideas, knight takes d4, followed by bishop e6, and bishop e6 right away, I think both of those lines give black a very playable position that people can enjoy playing if they like the off-balance and attacking nature of these positions. Stay tuned next time. I plan on covering the Chinese dragon, which is an alternative to rook c8 when white plays the bishop c4 line.